We're almost to the end here. We're at population ecology. By the end of this video, you're going to be able to use words like population size, density, distribution, growth, growth rate, age structure, survivorship, and compare and contrast logistic and exponential growth. When we started out, we talked about an ecosystem, all the biotic and abiotic, living and non-living things in a place. One step down was a community looking at all of the different living things in a place. Now we're looking at a population, which is just one species in an area, a group of organisms of the same species in the same area. For example, all the seals in the Arctic. When we look at populations, human, plant, animal, etc., we can describe them in many ways. First is the population size, and that's just simply how many organisms are in that population. Size influences survival. If you have a smaller population, there's a higher risk for extinction. Makes sense. Population density is how many individuals are there in a given space. If we wanted to put this in simple words, it's how crowded is an area. Overcrowding is bad. That's obvious. If you pack a ton of people into a small place, you start having issues with hygiene and getting rid of wastes. Disease gets passed around faster. And of course, this affects more than just humans. It's any living thing. But overcrowding affects health. Easy to tie this into humans, though, because it makes sense to us. It's readily available, all this information all the time. So this is a map of the United States. The darker the color, the denser the population. You can see here Milwaukee, Chicago area, very dense. Parts of California, west, not so dense. The Pilgrims came and settled on the East Coast, and then people slowly moved westwards. But there's not as much of a suitable environment in the West for a lot of people, so it makes sense that most people are concentrated on the East Coast here. We can describe how populations are distributed, which is how they're spread out. Clumped means clustered in groups, and this usually happens because there's a certain resource that everybody hangs out around. Which picture on the right represents clumped distribution? If you said the bottom one, you are correct. Random is just unpredictable distribution. Which picture shows that? That would be the middle. And lastly, some organisms might have uniform distribution. They're evenly spaced. That's the top picture. Some organisms are very territorial, and so they have these areas that are their own, and it's more of a uniform distribution. We can measure populations in a variety of ways. First, we can look at the growth, which is just simply how the population has changed over time. Related to that, we can measure growth rate, how fast the population changes over time. Things that increase the birth rate, make a population grow faster, would be birth and immigration, entering a place. Growth rate can decrease due to death and emigration or exiting. We can put this in an equation, so you could take the births plus immigration, subtract the deaths and emigration, and that gives you the growth rate of a population. Mostly for humans, we can use age structure diagrams or population pyramids. We'll look more at these later on in the next video. You may have seen these before in the social studies department. Some people have told me that they've done this before, where we look at these pyramids, and they're not always regular shaped pyramids, depending on if it's fast, slow, or negative growth. It basically shows how many people are lumped in each age category, boys on the left, girls on the right. So in Argentina 2009, there were the most people under the age of 30 in that population of Argentina. As we go up the pyramid, there's less people. It makes sense. Most people don't live past their 80s, 90s, and into their hundreds. You can look at different types of graphs. So here's rapid growth, just like Argentina's. The bottom is wide. So as these people grow up and reach this area, there's going to be a lot of people in the middle for having kids. Over here we have slow growth, which is like in the United States. Not a lot of people, so most people in this middle group only have 1 or 2 kids, and so the amount of children at the lower levels is very small compared to Kenya, where they have lots of kids. And we'll talk about why that will be later. So when this is almost, you have just a slight period, but almost straight down, that is slow growth. Zero growth would be this one, where the middle is wider than the bottom, so growth rate is going down. That rate is opposite of what it is, let's say, from here in Argentina. We can look at survivorship curves, and for these, if I give you this graph and I give you, let's say, this information, not having a lot of offspring, parents provide a lot of care, offspring live a long time, you should be able to tell me if this represents type 1, type 2, or type 3 organisms. Now, don't be intimidated by all the lines on here. Let's break this down. Here we have time, so from being born to the time of death. Up the left we have percentage of organisms surviving, so how many out of that population are still alive. Type 1 is this line, so ignore the other two at the moment. Humans are an example of a type 1 species. We have only a couple kids, we give them a lot of care throughout their life, and so the offspring live a long time. Right here, many are alive as we continue on, so midlife, many are still alive, and then our population starts to decrease the older we get. Type 2 organisms like songbirds provide moderate care to moderate amounts of offspring. Death is relatively uniform throughout life, so that would be this line here. Midlife, about half of the population is dead, so think about how easy it is for songbirds to die. Various predators, environmental factors, not as much parental care. And then population decreases continually over time. Type 3 would be like a frog or a turtle or a fish that just lay a ton of eggs and have a ton of offspring, but that's it. They walk away, they don't really raise their children, they're not really considered children because they're not human, but you know what I mean. They don't provide a lot of care, and so it's just like when turtle eggs hatch and you see those pictures of all the turtles racing their way to the ocean. Most of them are going to die. They're going to be eaten. The mama turtle's not sitting there caring for all of them. So death is very high at young stages, and then over time death continues to increase. That would be type 3. These I really do expect you to know well. We have two types of models for population growth. First is exponential. This happens in ideal conditions where growth starts slow, and as the population gets bigger, the rate speeds up, the population explodes, and you end up with this J-shaped curve. Make sure you draw this general pattern in your notes. This doesn't usually happen though. You can see our population in the world is in exponential growth right now, but the higher the population, you're going to eventually run out of space. Think about bacteria in a petri dish. Okay, the petri dish is only big enough to support a certain amount of bacteria. If you let them go too long, they're going to poison themselves with their own wastes. They're going to run out of space, run out of food, etc. Those things are limiting factors, and limiting factors lead to this type of population growth called logistic growth. Starts out exponential, but then we hit this line called K. K stands for carrying capacity. That's basically when we hit our limit. Crowding, disease, food, wastes limit the population. The shape of the curve is an S. Not a perfect S, kind of squished, but make sure you draw that out. In terms of the human population, we have not reached K yet, but we don't know where it is. When are we going to be limited by the environment around us and crowding and disease? When are we going to hit K and our growth drops off? Nobody knows. In sum, we have different properties. We have size, density, and distribution. We can measure populations in terms of their growth, growth rate, age structure, survivorship, and look at patterns of growth, exponential and logistic. Your assignment is called a word splash, and I have a separate video clip that explains this, so I'd encourage you to watch that video for how to do this because you're probably going to be lost otherwise. But as for that, that's the end of this video. You should be able to describe a population in terms of size, density, distribution, population growth, growth rate, age structure, survivorship, and then compare and contrast logistic and exponential growth.